Okay, good evening again. So, Crossing Over the Flood, which is out of the Samyutta Nikaya, is actually the first sutta in that big Pali text. So I am going to do what I usually do here, which is I'm just going to read that sutta, which hopefully you all have in front of you, and then I will talk about it. And then having talked about it, I will stop talking and we will discuss together. So it goes thus. I have heard that on one occasion the Blessed One was staying near Savatthi in Jeta's grove, Anathapindika's monastery. Then a certain devata in the far extreme of the night, her extreme radiance lighting up the entirety of Jeta's grove, went to the Blessed One. On arrival, having bowed down to him, she stood to one side. As she was standing there, she said to him, "Tell me, dear sir, how you crossed over the flood." "I crossed over the flood without pushing forward, without staying in place." "But how, dear sir, did you cross over the flood without pushing forward, without staying in place?" "When I pushed forward, I was whirled around. When I stayed in place, I sank. And so I crossed over the flood without pushing forward, without staying in place." And then the Devata spoke in verse. "At long last I see a Brahman totally unbound, who, without pushing forward, without staying in place, has crossed over the entanglements of the world." That is what the Devata said. The teacher approved. Realizing that the teacher has approved of me, she bowed down to him, circumambulated him, keeping him to her right, and then vanished right there. So that's the sutta. It's a fairly short sutta. It is one that for a number of years has really resonated with me. This idea of not pushing forward and not staying in place, and something that is neither pushing forward and nor staying in place being the right approach. That's really resonated. And so this has become just one of those suttas that I use and I go to regularly. It's actually one that at the transmission ceremony that Lisa held for me, or with me, a couple of years ago now, this is the sutta that I chose as being like one I really liked that felt relevant. Feels really simple, and I'm really glad I picked this one to talk about this evening, because it's really short, and I thought, well, I'm going to talk about this and I'm not going to have much to say because it's really short and really simple, so let me do a little bit of reading around it and see if there's a little more here. And there is, and I thought it was very powerful. So going through it again together. We've talked before about Savatthi and Jeta's grove, Anathapindika's monastery. That was the land where somebody wanted to buy land and give it to the Buddha because it was great land, and the owner said only if you put a gold coin on every piece. So that's this piece of land. Devata, this is the first of there's 5 maggas or books in the Samyutta Nikaya, and the book is like 1,500 pages. So the books, one of them is about the 5 aggregates, one is about the 6 sense gates, the last one is about the 37 factors of awakening, so it's the Noble Eightfold Path and the 7 factors of awakening and so on and so forth, all of those, the 4 right strivings, etc. The first of the 5 is a whole series of very short suttas in which the Buddha encounters devas and devatas who he has short exchanges with, and then there's poetry involved, poems, and then they disappear. So it's full of all these magical encounters with mystical beings. The Samyutta Nikaya of all of the main collections is the hardcore teaching. It's the one that's most organized and structured around clear teaching messages. So it's really interesting that as a strong man would flex his arm, so the Buddha, seeing suffering on the other side of India, just showed up there and spoke to somebody. Or these devatas just show up and talk to him. This is something we find difficult in our time and age, and we think of it as, just stories. But I have a hard time seeing it as just stories, since it shows up so much, and it shows up in these hardcore teachings. I'm not going to say what it is, because I don't know what it is. But I think there's a lot more there than meets the eye, and there's a call there to open up to mystery, maybe. Tell me, dear sir, how you crossed over the flood. So the flood, I always thought of that as the same flood that we talk of a raft crossing. It's a river, and we build a raft across to the other shore, and having crossed to the other shore, we do not pick up the raft and carry it with us, and the other shore is awakening, and this shore is samsara, so we build this raft and we cross over. And this is saying we don't cross over that by pushing forward or by staying in place. And that's true. And here's where I found something that I think is really interesting. Ogha means flood, and there are actually 4 floods defined in the Pali Canon, in the Pali Sutras. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 4 floods and look at the context of this not standing still, not pushing forward to cross over these 4 floods. The 4 floods, and if you want to look it up, they're, among other places, they're defined in Samyutta Nikaya 45, 171. So you can look it up and see that for yourselves. The 4 floods: sense desires or karma, becoming, bhava, views, which is atti, and ignorance, which is avidya. Sense desires, becoming, views, and ignorance. These are actually very similar to the 4 clingings that we've heard elsewhere. The 4 clingings are sensuality, views, habits and practice, and doctrine of self. So 2 of them are pretty much exactly the same. Sensuality, sense desires, views. To me, becoming ties very closely to doctrine of self. And you can make an argument that ignorance and habits and practices, which are behavior that comes out of conditioning without reflection, are very closely related. But however you get there, I think these 2 groups are closely related. So, not pushing forward and not standing still as it relates to sense desires. Sense desires, if we go to the Dhamma Chakkavapattana Sutta, which is the turning the wheel of the Dharma, which is the first sutta that Buddha taught when he came back from waking up. He went to his 4 former practitioners and he itemized the 4 Noble Truths for the first time. And in that, he talked about the extremes of self-indulgence and self-mortification, and not being drawn to either of those extremes, the practitioner finds the middle way. Sense desires offers the extremes of self-indulgence and self-mortification. The extremes of self-indulgence and self-mortification are kind of related to pushing forward and standing still. I'd argue standing still is akin to self-indulgence. We become stagnant and kind of stuck. Pushing forward is driving ourselves to asceticism. That's self-mortification. So we do not push forward, we do not stand still, we find the middle way. And the middle way between these 2, in this context, it's easy to think of, and many people do think of that as just a balance between the 2. But as we go on down the list, that balance doesn't work. It's clearly not a balance, it's a third way. The middle way is something different. So the second one, becoming. The second flood is becoming. The extremes of becoming is basically becoming and not becoming, or unbecoming. Becoming drives us to eternalism, and the other extreme is nihilism or annihilation. And so not pushing forward, we push forward into becoming, and we stand still in annihilation. It's not doing neither of those. What's the middle way between those? What's not standing forward and not standing still? It's not eternalism, and it's not annihilation. It's not like a balance between the two. You can't find halfway between those two. But that's what we're talking about with not standing still and not pushing forward as it relates to this particular flood. The third flood is views. The extremes of views are existence and non-existence. See something as being or not being. That's one talked about at length in a previous sutta that I picked for this course over this series, which is the Kaccayana Sutta. The Kaccayana Sutta is saying where one is not drawn to either extreme of existence or non-existence. This is the path, and then it lists the 12-link chain of causation, and then lists the chain in reverse order as unraveling that chain, and that's the path. So the middle way here, again, it's not a middle way, it's not halfway between existence and non-existence, it's clearly grokking dependent origination. So not pushing forward and not standing still with respect to that flood is landing on dependent origination and not moving to a view of existence or a view of non-existence. The fourth flood is ignorance. I read a rather convoluted discussion there about ignorance, in which talked about introversion and extroversion, which felt a little opaque, and we won't go there. So, but constructively, ignorance is seeing things other than the way they are, and I think what that analysis points at is a subject and an object, really. And when we see subject-object, we become stuck. And so not pushing into that realm, what does that look like? Not pushing forward and not standing still feels to me like, well, it's seeing clearly, it's right view, but it's non-duality, and not non-duality as opposed to duality, because that's another duality. It's a word that I came across, or a phrase that I came across, is a-dual. So not non-dual, which is a thing, but a-dual, which is not dual. It's not dual and it's not non-dual, it's a-dual. So this, to me, not standing still, not pushing forward, is, if you slow down and think about it with the four floods, a very clear articulation of the middle way, and the middle way not as a balance or a compromise, but as a totally different way of seeing the world. Not pushing forward, not standing still. When I pushed forward, I was whirled about. Pushing forward is creating a lot of noise. When I stood still, when I stayed in place, I sank. Dark and empty, not empty in the Buddhist sense, but just empty. And so I crossed over the flood without pushing forward, without staying in place. The Devata recited her verse, which recapitulates, and then the teacher approved that, which showed that she had... there's one thing about the verse. She said, "At long last I see a Brahman totally unbound." So she realized what that meant. Brahman historically was used as one of the four classes of person in that culture, which still exists today as the caste system. There is an understanding of that structure in commentaries on the Gita and other texts in the Sanatana Dharma, which says that those classes aren't by virtue of birthright but are by virtue of ability, which is basically the path that Buddha has taken. He said a Brahmin isn't a Brahmin because of who their parents are. A Brahmin is a Brahmin because of how they live their life and how they engage in their practice. And that's what the Devatara is saying here. At last I see one who is totally unbound, not tied, not entangled, the fire that is liberated. So the teacher approved that, and she disappeared. Which is kind of a... There's two things that can be said there. One is the mystical, that's what a Devata is. The other is maybe that's a reference to some form of waking up. She ceased to be a Devata. As when Siddhartha Gautama woke up, he ceased to be Siddhartha Gautama and became Buddha. So that's what I have for you this evening, the Crossing over the Flood, which, as I say, I've always found it, or for many years I've found it very lovely, but now that I understand more deeply how we can look at this flood, I find it even more meaningful and an even richer sutta, and I hope you do too. So I will now make this stop recording.